happened next, Betty?
All right, all right. I'll read a little more. It's getting a little late, Lizard Man. It was a great surprise to Scrooge while listening to the moaning of the wind and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss whose depths were secret as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge while thus engaged to hear a hearty laugh, with much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room with the Spirit standing, smiling by his side, and looking at the same nephew with an approving affability. "Ha ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha ha ha! If you should happen by any unlikely chance to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say, I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is infection and disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his side, rolling his head, twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends being not a bit behind and roared out lustily. "He said that Christmas was a humbug as I live," cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. "Bless those women. They never care to do anything by halves. They are always in earnest." She was exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was all kinds of good little dots about her chin, and melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in a little creature's head. Altogether, she was what you would have called provoking, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. "He's a comical old fella," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth. Not so pleasant as he might be, however. His offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against them. I'm sure he's very rich, Fred," hinted Scrooge's niece. "At least you always tell me so." "What is that, my dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth is no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking, ha 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 ha, that he is ever going to benefit you with it." Oh, I think it's supposed to be us with it. "I have no patience with him," observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew, "and I'm sorry for him. Couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his own ill whims himself, always here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner. Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same. They must be allowed to have the competent judges because they had just had dinner. The dessert was on the table and they were fussed around the fire by lamplight. Well, I'm very glad to hear it, said Scrooge's nephew, because I have great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper had clearly got his eye on one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject, whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. Do go on, Fred, said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. He never finishes what he begins to say. He's such a ridiculous fella. Scrooge's nephew reveled in another laugh, and as it was impossible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister had not hard to do with an aromatic vinegar, his example was unanimously followed. I was only going to say, said Scrooge's nephew, that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments which could do him no harm. I'm sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his moldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there in good temper year after year saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? It only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk 50 pounds. That's something. I think I shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, and so they laughed at any rate. He encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about when they sung a glee or catch. I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away at the bass like a good one, and never swell the large veins in his forehead, or get red in his face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among the other tunes simple little air, a mere nothing you might learn to whistle in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded of ghosts of Christmas past. When this strain of music sounded, all the things the ghost of children came upon his mind, he softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley's body. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits, for it is good to be children sometimes, and never better at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop! There was first a game at blind man's buff. Of course there was, and I no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is there's a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and the ghost of Christmas present knew it. The way he went out after the plump sister and the lace tucker was an outrage of the credulity of human nature. Knocking rage on human nature. Knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping up against the piano. smothering himself among the curtains wherever she went. There he went. He always knew where the plump sister was. Wouldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, as some of them did on purpose, he would have made a feint of endeavoring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really wasn't. But when at last he caught her, when in spite of all her silk and rustlings and rapid flutterings past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape, then his conduct was the most execrable. For his pretending not to know her, his pretending it was necessary to touch her headdress and further assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger and a certain chain around her neck was vile, monstrous. What am I reading? No doubt she told him her opinion of it when another blind man being in the office and they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not of the blind man's buff party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and footstool in a snug corner where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her, but she joined in the forfeits and loved her to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise, at the game of how, when, where, she was very great, and to secret joy of Scrooge's nephew beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as Topper could have told you. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting, in the interest he had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears. He sometimes came out with his guess quite loud, and very often guessed quite right, too. For the sharpest needle, best Whitechapel, warranted not cut in the eye, was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it, and it had to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in the mood, and looked upon him with such favor that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed, but the spirit said this could not be done. Here is a new game, said Scrooge. 1/2 hour, spirit, only one. It's a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. The only answer to the questions, yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal rather than a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and then walked about the streets, and wasn't made of wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a Monterey, and was never killed in a market. He was not a horse, or a donkey, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, the nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At the last, the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I have found out. I know what it is, Fred. I know what it is." "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge." Which it certainly was. Admiration was on the universal sentiment. There was some objective that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes. as much as an answer with the negative sufficient to divert their inner thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they had ever had any tendency that way. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure," said Fred. "It would be ungrateful not to drink to his health. Here's a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at that moment, and I say to Uncle Scrooge." "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried, "a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, wherever he is," said Scrooge's nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but may he have it nevertheless." Uncle Scrooge! Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged an unconscious company in return, and thanked them in inaudible speech if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again up on their travels. Much they saw and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. Spirits stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful on foreign lands, and they were close at home by struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope by poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man and his little brief authority had not been made that fast the door and barred the spirit out. He left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into a space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form. The ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge observed this change, but never spoke of it, until they left the children's 12th-night party, when looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noted that his hair was gray. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight!" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight. Hark, the time is drawing near." The chimes were ringing, and the 3/4 past 11 at that moment. "Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange, not belonging to yourself, protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." From the foldings of its robe it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at his feet and clung out on the side of its garment. "Oh, man, look here! Look down here!" exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility, where graceful youth should have filled their feathers out and touched them with its freshest tints, and stale, shriveled hand, like that of age, had tints pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds, where angels might have sat and thrown devils lurked and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no preservation of humanity in any grade. Through all the mysteries of the wonderful creatures, has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge started back, appalled, having them shown to him in this way. He tried to say that they were fine children, but the words choked themselves. Rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude, "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them, "and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both in all their degree. But most of all, beware this boy, for on his brow I see that is written, which is doom. Unless the writing be erased, deny it," cried the spirit, stretching out his hand toward the city. "Slander those who tell it ye. Admit it for your facetious purposes, and make it worse, and abide the end. Have they no refuge or resource?" cried Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley. Lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him.